Good evening, everyone. Welcome to 52 Living Ideas. Thank you for joining us. The hosts tonight are Brian, Penny, and myself. Um, we will be discussing tonight what happened to the goddess and the divine feminine. And tonight we will be focusing on the Jewish culture in the early Iron Age. So Brian is going to give his presentation, and I'm going to start. We're going to stop intermittently for questions. So if you have questions, please write them down, and then we will discuss them. Uh, we will discuss them when the time comes. So with that, I'm going to start the presentation for Brian, and then whenever you're ready, just give me 1 minute, and then you can start. I'm just going to give you the full view. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Brian, whenever you're ready.
Okay, this presentation and the last one are in response to rather persistent and urgent questions that we got in presenting on the series, The Divine Feminine. We were going through various goddesses, I think each of which has something to contribute even to they're ancient goddesses. They have something to contribute to our current and contemporary lives. But people wanted to know, why are there no goddesses in the Western tradition? And so I agreed to take on that question. And we talked about Athens last time. And Athens is maybe an easier case because most of the Greek gods and goddesses are already eclipsed by more general abstractions. We've gotten away from personifications in the Greek philosophical tradition. And so the goddesses lapsed with all the other Greek gods and goddesses. Then I also showed that there was an evolution in early Iron Age Athens, where some goddesses superseded other goddesses, and so the goddesses were adapting to the changes in society that were happening during the Iron Age, early Iron Age in Athens. That is a crucial period. Carl Jaspers refers to that generally. This is very generally as the Axial Age, which raised a lot of philosophical questions in terms that we're still dealing with them today. So it turned out that was a good period of time to focus on. I think it does answer the question, what happened to the goddesses in the Western tradition? So as I said, we talked about Athens last time. This time we're going to talk about Jerusalem, another key city. And there, I think the answer is a little more difficult because the Jewish God has not been eclipsed with time. We haven't moved on to just general principles. There's still the personification of the deity in God, which I'll refer to as Yahweh for most of this presentation, because that's the term that seems to have been used back in the period we're looking at, which is 900 to 500 BC. And that is that turns out to be, again, a very good period of time. It does it really does answer the question, what happened, or at least I am not Jewish. Not a Jewish scholar, but I've read now quite a bit, and it does seem to be the period of time in which it's possible to offer an answer to this question for the Jewish tradition. A key point is the return of the Jews from Babylon, the Babylonian exile. At that point, it's felt that the Bible, as we know it, the Old Testament, as the Christians know it, reached its final form. Also, in the 600s BC, I've discovered that most of the scholars feel that most of the historical books, in fact, I'd say all of the books of the Bible through the histories, which end with Josiah and his sons. In other words, they end with the beginning of the Babylonian exile. All of those books were probably written in the 600s BC. So that turns out to be a good period of time to look at. So let's move on here and see what there is. Again, this is a part of a series that we're looking at what happened. The Divine Feminine is the series, and we're looking at what happened to the goddesses just for a couple of sessions. As I've already said, last time we looked at Athens, this time we're looking at Jerusalem. And there, I think the story is a little different. There's not evolving hierarchies of gods. There was a suppression of the goddess, together, I might add, with the suppression of other gods other than Yahweh. So this suppression wasn't focused just on goddesses, but as we'll see, the goddesses were a key focus for the efforts, the Yahwist efforts, the monotheistic efforts during this period, because the goddess was so popular in Judea or Judah and the rest of Israel. And we're going to go back and starting at about 900, we're going to look at Solomon, Hezekiah, Joshua, and Ezra. Solomon was definitely a goddess worshiper, and the others definitely were not. So this gives us a chance to trace the evolution. Solomon lived or was reigning in the early 900s, and then the others in the Hezekiah and Joshua in 600s BC, and then Ezra came back about 80 years after the first Jews returned from Babylon, and he did around 450 BC. He was active in Jerusalem. Okay, let's go on. So I'm not this slide, this presentation, or the slides turn out to be kind of lengthy today. I'm not going to try to read them all, but I thought it'd be useful. I wouldn't mind if we were to post and make these slides available to everybody who wants to look back and have more background, because I found the background to be very helpful for me. And there's a lot of the substance this evening is focusing on the context in which the goddesses were suppressed, because it's pretty obvious that they were suppressed, and that's kind of a short story. But understanding how and why I think is really the more interesting part, and that takes an understanding of the context. So I'm going to talk first of all about the benefits in this of the series. Just want to remind everybody, and this is where I'm going to try to help people focus on what I think are some useful takeaways from this evening. Then I'm going to talk generally about the early Iron Age, because I think there were influences in both Athens and Jerusalem that had an effect on goddesses. Then I'm going to talk about traditional religious practices in Judah. This was really quite a surprise for me when I started looking into it to answer the questions, and the polytheism and in particular goddess worship was widespread and very popular in Judah and the rest of Israel, really throughout this entire period from 900 to 500 and even 400 BC. Both in the countryside and in the temple. The worship in the temple was more, goddess worship in the temple was more episodic. And I note here that I'm talking about Judah. That's basically, let's just say that's the city-state around Jerusalem. There are other important cities in Israel. Samaria was one. Shechem was another. Megiddo, and then Hazor. There are other cities. They tended to have, their countryside around them in which they exercised a predominant influence. And Judah was just the place where Jerusalem exercised a lot of influence. So that's what we're going to really focus on, because you'll see that Israel, the kingdom of Israel, which is north of Judah, kind of disappears in the middle of this story. And the other part that was kind of interesting to me, again, I did not put this all together until I worked on this report, but government suppression was really an important part of the doing away with the traditional Jewish religious or Judean religious practices. The government that was the parties, the Yahwist parties that were pushing for more centralization of the state were the ones who were pushing for monotheism. And as a part of that policy, they were pushing to eliminate the goddess worship. So the focus here is not just what you would consider religious, that it's political and religious, and that should be clear throughout, because we'll talk consistently about what the kings are doing. And I think that's a very big sign that this is really political as well as religious. In fact, I'm not sure they viewed politics and religion in the same way that we might. So there are three important periods for the Yahwist movement, and this is the one that was monotheistic. The reign of Hezekiah, the reign of Josiah, and then the arrival of the scribe Ezra. Note that the first two are kings. That's when the Judah had some degree of political independence, as personified in the king. After the Babylonian exile, the independence was more diminished, and that's evidenced by the fact that there were governors that came in from Babylon. They were not kings from Judah. And then that the scribe was sent, and the scribe was a government official from Babylon who also had a significant impact on religious policy. Okay. So the benefits from this series of this meetups, which I'm trying to keep in mind, is to raise awareness and express gratitude for the divine feminine, both in her presence and absence. And I think, this evening we'll be probably thinking and talking more about her absence. But I also want to provide a forum where participants are encouraged to speak about the divine feminine or the absence of the divine feminine in their lives. So I hope everyone will take this opportunity to do so. I think that's a great element of this format, the 52 Living Ideas. Okay, next. So benefits from this series, again, in general, and these are some benefits that we've already derived from looking at other ancient goddesses. The understanding of goddess quests, which is a complement to hero journeys. There's a lot in modern philosophy, psychology, mythology, the current ethos on hero journeys, the individual quest, but it's often focused on men, but they're also goddess quests. And those are brought out when you take a look at the history of the goddesses. And another thing that I really like is the sacred marriage. In other words, you could have a quest that's not just individual. It's not just the goddess or just the hero alone. You could be doing things together. And that would be Isis and Osiris, Inanna and Dumuzi, who's also called Tammuz in some traditions. This is a sharing of capabilities and responsibilities in a complementary manner. And that's, again, something that comes out in the goddess traditions that really tends to get lost in the god traditions. I think another element of importance for goddesses, a role that the divine feminine plays in all of our lives, and it's captured in these ancient traditions, is the intergenerational transitions, the stability that the goddesses provide in shifting power from fathers to sons. And you see that so often in these goddess traditions, where the goddess is involved in shifting power from the king to his successor, typically a son. There's more of a focus on nature, more of a focus on emotions. And one thing I think is really important, it tends to be more of an inclusive attitude than an exclusive attitude. We've already seen that in some of these goddess traditions, and that's going to really come out again this evening. So let's go on. So I framed the rest of these benefits as invitations from the goddess. It's things, to think about. And that's already, I think, a good takeaway, because the goddess doesn't insist or order. The goddess invites, whereas gods tend to insist and order. The very first one is that the goddess invites us to see differences amongst people and things, institutions, as complementary rather than oppositional. For example, that they're neither male nor female is bad. They're both necessary to be complete. And so they're not focusing on the oppositional. To obtain this completeness, it needs to be non-oppositional. But the oppositional tends to see things as good and bad, God and Satan, orthodoxy and apostasy. And one of the things I thought about doing for this evening was presenting, just like I did last time, I presented a drama, the Oresteia, which captured very nicely many of the points I wanted to make. I thought about presenting the story of Adam and Eve this evening, because there are interpretations of Adam and Eve that make the differences between gods and goddesses very clear, and the suppression of the goddess in the Jewish tradition clear. But there's so many interpretations of the Adam and Eve, and it definitely is subject to interpretation. Any interpretation is necessarily ambiguous. There's a subjective element there. And when you look back at the history, I think it's much less ambiguous, and there's less of a subjective element. So if I were to summarize the story of Adam and Eve from this perspective, before the fall of man, the predominant paradigm was male-female. After the fall of man, which is complementary, non-oppositional, after the fall of man, there's the knowledge of good and evil, and things become oppositional. There's a lot of conflict, Cain and Abel, and all the rest. So it's a shift together with all the other interpretations you can give to that story, there's a shift from the male-female complementary paradigm, kind of like yin and yang, to the good-bad paradigm, which is really it's a lot like the Zoroastrian tradition, which splits between matter and spirit. Okay, now these are what I think might be some key topics to focus on. Hopefully we're going to get to these things this evening. I would say that in general, the goddess worship in this part of the world, Judah and Israel, was tolerant, open, diverse, decentralized, and focused on consent or consensus, non-hierarchical. Whereas the Yahwist party, that's in the Yahwist camp, was much more focused on orthodoxy, isolation, homogeneity, centralization, and hierarchy. And there's a couple more things that I think come out in this period that aren't tied directly to the goddess, but I think are interesting. It's an introduction to a priestly period. And I think, these periods overlap, and in many ways we're still in a priestly period. There's a priestly period that preceded the scribal period and continued during the scribal period. That's something we've talked about in the 52 Living Ideas. I guess the point is, and the scribes tend to copy what's already been written, and then they talk about it. That's the ideal situation in the scribal period, I guess. But they have to have something to copy, and that tends to have been written by the priests, sometimes the prophets, but the priests and prophets are the ones who put these things in writing in the first place. And before you can have the scribes copying them. There are other elements to the scribal tradition that differ from the priestly, and that ties into orthodoxy, and that just in the tradition of the monotheistic tradition in the West, you tended to copy down the things that were the orthodox texts, and you were discouraged from deviating from those in your discussions. And then the next thing that really struck me, because I was reading in some of these books I read, when I put together this presentation, I first thought I could just use basically the texts I had that were written about goddesses. But I realized that wouldn't work. Typically, they had good material. They had 1 or 2 chapters. But number one, I thought, well, they probably all kind of have a point that they want to make. And so that raised a question of credibility for me. And so I decided I would look to some texts that were written more by biblical scholars. And since I was focusing on Jewish traditions, I did Jewish biblical scholars. And I have one that's focused on archaeology, one that's focused on history, and one that's focused on the Bible that I used in this work. And one of the points that one of the authors said was that they're really not sure why the one God turned out to be a male. And for that, well, there'll be some things here that we can point to in a minute on why that might have happened. But I guess the one thing that strikes me is that we were in a period of time where we're still dealing in metaphors. And one of the metaphors, the metaphor that was prevalent in describing gods was personifications. Personifications tended to be gendered. So it was going to be male or female. And for some pretty basic reasons, I think it turned out that this god was a male god. Okay, can we go on? Other invitations from the goddess focus more on peace than war, focus on natural and organic, in addition to man-made and mechanical. That's where the the feminine, it tends to be more inclusive. It's not saying, they would not say natural and organic instead of man-made and mechanical. The man-made and mechanical is not bad, but the natural and the organic complement and work together with the man-made and mechanical. And then the same is true for the small, intimate, and vulnerable contexts, in addition to the big public and the ones where people present themselves more as invulnerable. Also, I've read in some of the books that the feminine tends to focus more on beginnings and nurturings rather than endings and destruction. So those are things to just think about as we go through this. Next. So the early Iron Age influences that affected goddesses, really the decline of goddesses in both Athens and Jerusalem. Next, we can go to the next slide. First of all, early Iron Age happened after the collapse of the Bronze Age. This was an age of tremendous turmoil, and it was turmoil in what's called the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, the Levant. It's kind of that boomerang-shaped area of land between Egypt and the Arab, I think it's called the Arab, the current day Persia or Iran. And the one thing to realize, that area, it's very fertile, but it's also very open to attack, both from the ocean in the Mediterranean, from the mountains, which are to the north of the Euphrates, and also from the desert. And that tends to be overlooked. That's where the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples come from. And that there were just wave after wave of invasions. When you look at the history of this part of the world, the sea peoples that came through there, they're the ones who supposedly contributed or precipitated the Bronze Age collapse. And there were entire civilizations and cities destroyed by these people. But there were also nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples in the area, and who were active both before and after the Bronze Age collapse. For example, the Amorites move into Babylon. The Hammurabi was an Amorite, and obviously brought some civilizing influences there. The Hebrews moved into Judah or Judea, and that's there's a lot of debate about everything in the Bible, but we'll just, for present purposes, I think it's enough to say that the Hebrews moved into Judah in or around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. The historic period, the archaeological record tends to start in the early Iron Age. So Joshua could be seen as an archetypical example of that. Although there are people who, there's no archaeological record that substantiates the story of Joshua, but it's probably true that the Hebrews were one of the tribes that came in from the desert and the highlands, in addition to already being there as elements of the society that had collapsed and was collapsing as part of the Bronze Age collapse. All right, so the Sea Peoples then settled in these areas, and they brought with them their influences, their foreign influences. And that's one thing that always strikes me when you read the Bible, is that they're talking about the foreign gods and the foreign peoples. The Hebrews were foreigners when they came, and that's illustrated by the story of Joshua and Moses coming into the Promised Land. So anyway, the intra and tribal conflicts, that it plays a big part in this suppression of the goddesses that we'll get to. And large empires conflict with small city-states. So the Assyrians, Egyptians, Hittites, and other invaders roll over these smaller tribes and nations, these smaller, excuse me, smaller city-states and nations, because a lot of these tribes were consolidating and becoming city-states and young nations. And then that's after the Bronze Age collapse. And then the empires came in and took them over and converted them either in, first of all, into client and vassal states, and then into provinces. That's kind of important because I think you'll find that the smaller groups tended towards, I wouldn't say monotheism, but a smaller group of gods, one god, one hierarchy of gods. And there was a tendency towards having one top god. The large empires couldn't do that, or they didn't do it. They didn't find it expedient because they couldn't really impose their one god over a vast territory. So most of the empires, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians really didn't spend that much time out of Egypt, but I think even the Egyptians were much more tolerant for local religions than were the national city-states and the small nations, where it was more credible or possible to exercise that kind of homogeneity. Okay. Iron Age developments that led to the decline of goddesses. So this we touched on already once. Iron weapons, the appointment of men as kings, iron tools and chariots. These all kind of go together. Again, the early Iron Age was very tumultuous, and the weapons for war and agriculture were becoming heavier, more effective. And it wasn't manpower anymore, it was animal power that drove these things. You'd use cattle for plowing and horses for chariots. And with all of this, you had a shift from women playing an important part, let's say outside the home, in the fields and in the agriculture, in the cities, and even in politics, and a shift towards men. That just seems to have been the case. Okay. And there's another thing that happened during this time. There's new industries were arising: mining, seafaring, blacksmithing, other industries, and a very big one that needs to be borne in mind is construction. These cities, the later ones, the later Iron Age, were built out of stone, or some of them were built out of stone. Or principal buildings were built out of stone, but in the earlier periods, it was all dried brick. And these dried brick would disintegrate in the rain and the sun and the wind. There was constant construction going on. And as these city-states grew, you're not only getting bigger, but you had to go back and keep repairing the homes and public works that were already in place. And this again was mostly men who did that. And as regards to public works, you had the walls that were being put up, irrigation canals were getting larger, there were cisterns that were being built and other things being put in place for defensive and for purpose of defense and supplying the people. in these larger cities. If you want to get a good idea of that, actually take a look at the Harappan culture in the Indus Valley. They had tremendous waterworks that they put in place. And creating and maintaining those must have taken a lot of work. And then the men tended to do that. So again, you have the ascendance of men that probably contributed to the ascendance of gods over goddesses. And then increasingly, gods tended to embody the spirit of politics. With the smaller political groups, you tended to have goddesses. As they got bigger and bigger, and war became more prevalent, and the weapons, the means of war became heavier, the men became more important. In fact, the first kings, there's been a lot of study on this, but it seems like there's more and more of a consensus. The first kings were appointed on a provisional basis to meet kind of under duress in situations of national security, where they needed to take charge of national defense or defense of the city. You would appoint a king, and there was no standing army. He would bring together the people, the men mostly, and they would fight whatever this external enemy was. And that those provisional temporary arrangements, which typically involve men, I'd say almost exclusively involved men based on the record, evolved into more permanent positions. So the spirits of polities, if we have these hierarchies of gods, tended to be presided over by men. So for example, or by gods instead of goddesses. So for example, later on, we're going to see, yes, in traditional Hebrew and other religious practices in early Judah, Yahweh probably had a consort, and that's the way it was written in the archaeological finds. Yahweh and his consort, the god comes first. If you go back later in time over into Sumeria in the Copper and Bronze Ages, it was the goddess that was mentioned first, like Inanna. That's one that we already studied. It was Inanna and her consort. So the goddess came first and the god second. And now that's been inverted with the god first and the goddess is the consort. Okay. Traditional religious practice in Judah. This was really an eye-opener for me. I knew nothing about this. And again, I looked to after having read some of these books about goddesses, I thought, well, I better look also to the Bible, obviously, although they quoted the Bible. I looked at the Bible verses they quoted and the context in the Bible for those quotes. And then I looked at these, the Jewish scholars that I mentioned earlier. And they're also mentioned in the introduction to this meeting. And it does seem to be quite, there's a consistency in the Bible and among these scholars that traditional religious practice in Judah, again, that's what I'm focusing on, the city-state of Jerusalem, it included goddess worship, and that's both before and after the arrival of the Hebrews. I use these different words like Hebrew. I find there's not a lot of consistency amongst the scholars. And also the translations of the Bible, they're not consistent either. But one thing seems to be consistent is that the word Jew was kind of settled on after both by the people at the time and by scholars since then, that the word Jew is taken to describe the people after the return from Babylon in early 500 down to 450 BC. So before that, I'm using the word Hebrew here. There are different words that can be used. Okay. Traditional religious practice in Judah includes goddess worship. Now here, I'm not going to try to read all these things, but I have included the quotes that I relied on for these conclusions. And I thought that would be of value to people, certainly invaluable to me. And sometimes the details are kind of interesting. So here's one that was written by Finkelstein and Silberman, who are they wrote this book, The Bible Unearthed, and it stood the test of time. It's fairly recent. It's gotten a lot of good press, and I do listen to lectures on Bible history and archaeology, and this book comes up time and time again. So it says here, the goddess worship was part of the timeless tradition of the hill country settlers who worshiped Yahweh along with a variety of gods and goddesses, known or adapted from the cults of neighboring peoples. So here you can already see one of the first characteristics of the goddess worship. It's not exclusive. You worship the goddess together with the god, and even other cults even from neighboring people. It's much more inclusive and open. And here's another quote. Since the high places were presumably open areas or natural hilltops, no definite archaeological traces of them have as yet been identified. So clearest archaeological evidence of the popularity of this type of worship throughout the kingdom is the discovery of hundreds of figurines of naked fertility goddesses, at every late monarchic site in Judah. So that is carrying through to the exile to Babylon. And for those of you who want to know more, I would encourage you to take a look at these books. I found it really fascinating. The next slide. Archaeological evidence of early religious practice in Israel and Judah. Now here we're distinguishing between Judah and Israel, and it's important to appreciate that the historical 12 tribes, the Hebrew 12 tribes, spread out over Judah in the south, all the way up to the north and where Jesus was living in Galilee. Most of the tribes are up north. And also there are geographical differences. It's worth it to look at a map to see the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. Judah is basically the area west of the Dead Sea. It is all highland. And the foothills that lead up to the highland. As you move west towards the Mediterranean, you get into the coastal area, and the coastal area is where the Philistines lived. The Philistines were probably one of the sea peoples. So after the collapse of the Bronze Age, you had the Philistines moving in to the coastal area, and that is attested in some Egyptian documents. That some of the sea peoples were moved by the Egyptians into that part of the world. And then the Judeans, Judeans is the word I use. I think that's more of a Roman derivative, but the Judeans are in the highlands. And that's been a kind of a border for a very long time. It's still a border today. So here's something that's a quote. More suggestive are the inscriptions found in the early 8th century. And here's some place in the northeastern Sinai. So that'd be further south, probably on the east side of the Dead Sea, because that's the Israelis, the northern tribes, had more influence there. A site that shows cultural links with the northern kingdom. They have apparently referred to the goddess Asherah as being the consort of Yahweh. And then they go on and says, unless it be assumed that Yahweh's married status was a sinful northern hallucination, a somewhat similar formula, speaking of Yahweh and his Asherah, appears in a late monarchy inscription from the Cephala of Judah. That's the hill country between the highlands of Judah and the coastal plain that's held by the Philistines. Okay. So again, it included goddess worship. And this, to me, this is a quote now. Again, I have to say, this was really kind of surprising to me because I hadn't taken the time to study this before. These are quotes from the Bible. And the Bible, as I don't know if it'll come out so clearly in this presentation, but it's pretty clear the Bible were written by monotheists. And so if they say that the Israelis, those are the 10 tribes up north, or the Judeans, who are the down south, that's the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, if they say that they're worshiping other gods, they probably are. So the people living in Judah in 931 to 914, so this is early, right after Solomon, during the reign of Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon, they did according to the abominations of the nations, which the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. So that's an interesting quote because it says that, first of all, these abominations are goddess worship and worship of other gods. And so this is an interesting quote because it says, number one, that before the Hebrews came, there were people there who were worshiping goddesses, and after the Hebrews came, they continued to worship the goddesses, and the people who worship the goddesses include some of the Hebrews. And I think that, that's probably a reliable statement because the people who wrote that weren't very happy with that situation. And then it goes on to say, Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, Yahweh, and they, the people living in Judah, provoked Yahweh to jealousy with their sins, which they committed, more than all their fathers had done. For they also built for themselves high places and pillars, and Asherim on every hill and under every green tree. Now, these are kind of, I haven't really traced it back, but the Asherim, those are poles which evoke the tree of life, and they were built to worship as places for worshiping the goddess. They tended to be set up on the tops of hills and in groves. And these other words, the high places and pillars, are kind of buzzwords that seem to be used consistently when describing these places where goddesses were worshipped. So this, the Bible passage that we're looking at was written by Deuteronomists during the reign of Josiah. He was a Yahwist, really just before the Babylonian exile. And the passage addresses religious practices in Judah during Rehoboam, the king of Judah and son of Solomon. So about 300 years earlier. And that means that Rehoboam was a king during the early monastic period. So basically now we have some sort of attestation, either in the Bible or the archaeological record, that there's been consistent goddess worship from the 900s to the 600s BCE in this area. Okay. I'm not going to do these. That's more to the same point, so we can skip those. And now here, this is King Solomon, who really was before Rehoboam, and he's you start to get some historical record, archaeological finds. I don't think there's a lot of historical records, so written documentation attesting to King Solomon. There's probably evidence that he existed, but that he ruled over a kingdom, a united kingdom, all the way covering all of the 10 tribes north of the Sea of Galilee, all the way down to south of the ocean, or excuse me, south of the Dead Sea, is, again, based on what I've read now from these authors, the Jewish authors, it's not attested, and there is some evidence that probably did not happen, but that he did exist is probably true, and had influence in and around Jerusalem. But here's a quote about him. Again, I really didn't appreciate this. Among King Solomon's wives were 700 princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away from Yahweh. Solomon followed Astarte. That's the Sidonian goddess, the equivalent of Asherah, the goddess of the Sidonians. So Solomon did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. He did not follow Yahweh completely or alone. So again, here it is that, the goddesses are open to other, they're not as jealous as Yahweh. But Solomon was really, obviously a key figure in the Jewish history, and he seemed to be a committed worshiper of goddesses. And then the goddesses, and this is a key point, the goddesses also report that because of Solomon's marriages to foreign wives and his worship of their gods and goddesses, Yahweh told Solomon that Solomon's son would lose control over the 12 tribes of Israel, except for Judah. And the northern tribes did, in fact, secede from Solomon's son. Rehoboam was his son. Jeroboam was the upstart king of the north. There's evidence in the Bible that some of the things in the Bible in this part of the Bible are kind of nasty. The Joshua had the instruction to exterminate everyone who was in the land of Canaan. And when they're talking now about this passage about Solomon, they say, well, for the ones that they couldn't exterminate, they enslaved for the purpose of building Solomon's building projects. And there's probably something to that. And because it says Jeroboam, there was a revolt of the northern tribes. They were being put down partly because they were goddess worshippers, and they were revolting because of the slave labor and the taxes. So I haven't quite puzzled that out, because I think maybe the Israelis were protesting against the taxes, and the Canaanites, who they had trouble exterminating, were probably protesting against the slave conditions. So that just kind of shows the situation there, and that this is a key point and this comes up time and time again. This goes all the way through this whole report this evening, and that is that marrying foreign wives is an apostasy. That makes Yahweh jealous. It's a violation of his law. Okay. So another interesting point is that King Solomon described wisdom as a goddess. In Proverbs, which is attributed to Solomon, wisdom is described as a woman or a goddess. And so here's the quote: "Blessed are those who find wisdom, those who find understanding, for she is more profitable than silver and yields better returns than gold. Her ways are pleasant ways, and her paths are peace. She is a tree of life." There we have the tree used as a symbol for the goddess. "A tree of life to those who take hold of her. Those who hold her fast will be blessed." So this is attributed to Solomon. It just shows that you can do the next slide. Again, he's using, and we can go on to the next one. I don't think we need to do all this. He's attributing all of this to wisdom, and he's personifying wisdom, and beyond that, personifying wisdom as a goddess. And so that's kind of interesting, because do these passages represent a personification of wisdom? The answer to that probably is yes, because in these passages, wisdom speaks for herself like a person. And if this is a point I tried to make earlier, if there's a reason for Yahweh having a gender at all, I think that possibly at this point in history, it was just the practice or the custom that these abstract qualities would be described through metaphors, and the customary metaphor was a person. If you look at North American Indians, they tend to use animals instead of people, but it's the same idea. Use a metaphor to capture some abstract quality. Okay. Here's another one I'm not sure we need to spend a lot of time on, but King Solomon was also involved in the Hieros Gamos. There's no biblical support for this, but it doesn't say he's involved in Hieros Gamos, but the scholars think that it is well possible because of all of his foreign wives. The foreign wives, most probably, some of them at least, came from religious traditions that included hierogamos. Hierogamos, says here in the very first part, is a ritual sex act enacted each year by representatives of a god and goddess in order to ensure a good harvest. And the hierogamos was practiced for centuries in the Near East, since at least 3000 BC. This goes back to Sumeria. I went back and just tried to pull out the most, let's say the date people are most confident about that this was going on, but some people think it goes back even to 4000 BCE. Writing evolved and began to emerge in 3500 BC in that part of the world. So also the Song of Solomon's, which is a book in the Bible that's attributed to Solomon, is surprisingly similar to the love poems that were chanted by the Sumerians during the Hierogamos, because we have written records of what the love poems that were chanted by the citizens when the king and queen, or the representatives of the god and goddess, were engaged in this ritual sex act. And they also have that from the Akkadians, who came to power, became ascendant after the Sumerians. So, and this goes back a long time before Solomon. But again, this is pointed to as evidence that he possibly or probably also engaged in these sex rituals. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So about 200, we're moving on now. We're going to jump ahead about 200 years to King Ahaz of Judah. All of the past, I've tried to give you an understanding of what the traditional religious practices in Judah were. And by traditional, I mean really before this period now with King Ahaz and Hezekiah, his son. And this is now a period of time that is attested historically. Things have been written of, things that a history was written as the things were occurring. So people are more confident that these things were happening. This is 200 years after Solomon and his son. And so here's a passage from the Bible written by Deuteronomists, who were Yahwists, monotheists, and they were not happy about this. They said that Ahaz of Judah offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places, on the hilltops, and under every spreading tree. And again, these are kind of buzzwords for places where the goddesses were worshipped. Okay, let's go on. So I didn't want to spend a lot of time on Ahaz. You can read about him in the Bible. These historical passages are really quite short and pretty straightforward. So it's not hard to read them. Yahwism is a Judean government suppression of traditional religious practices, including the suppression of goddess worship. So that's really a big takeaway from all the work I've done this over the past month to study this, relying on the Bible and these texts. It's a Judean government suppression, so it doesn't involve Israel. Israel actually no longer exists. We'll see that in a minute. And that's the northern tribes. Only one city-state exists, and that's the city-state in and around Jerusalem. And that's the Judean government. And that's the king and the priests. The king and the priests suppress traditional religious practices, including goddess worship. So that's something that really came out from my broader readings. The first readings I did were focused just on the suppression of goddess worship. This suppression of the goddesses is part of a broader government policy. And I think to me, after reading about this, there's no doubt that it's a government policy, because the kings are the ones who are doing it. Okay. As reported approvingly in the Bible, this is a summary now of what we're going to see up through to the Babylonian exile. As reported approvingly in the Bible, episodically, both Judean kings and priests actively suppressed all religious practices in Judah other than a centralized Orthodox worship of Yahweh. The suppressions applied to goddess worship, and this is really shocking to me, sometimes the suppressions included coercion and even brutality on the Judean people. So this is the Judean hierarchy, the kings and priests, imposing monotheism on their own people, and they're doing it against their will, using coercion and brutality. And this happened episodically between 722 and 516. So that's about 200 years. It's kind of interesting it was me when I reading and thinking about this. This is about a 200-year period. And the area that we're talking about, the area of land we're talking about, is smaller than Connecticut but bigger than Rhode Island. So this is really a kind of a key point in history right here. Okay. The context, Yahwism, again, it was a policy. The context of Yahwism under the kings, the Yahwist policy was promulgated by both kings and priests, all of whom were men, when opportunities for Judean national independence or expansion presented itself. Basically, in each of these cases, the Yahwists came to the fore when the Assyrians were in decline. The Assyrians were up in Mesopotamia, and when they were in decline, the Judeans were emboldened either to assert nationalism or even to expand their nationalism. Okay, now the intent of Yahwism under the kings. The express intent of Yahwism was to regain Yahweh's favor. The kings, priests, and prophets, the prophets were also all men, believed and expressly intended that Judah's belief, so that's the city-state's belief in Yahweh, would gain Yahweh's favor. And this was typically after a period where there was goddess worship and some sort of worship of other gods. They thought that this a belief in Yahweh would lead to Judah's national unity, and that this national unity was important in the present circumstances, either to preserve the state or to expand the state. Judah's national independence and Judah's conquest of territories to the north. Now, there are two important points, two important parts to this monotheism, this Yahwism. Number one, there is only one God, Yahweh, who happened to be a male. We already talked about that. But then the other part of it is that all Judeans must believe in Yahweh alone. They must believe in Yahweh and no other gods. And that this element involved coercion and even violence. The context and the intent of Yahwism under the Babylonian and Achaemenid Empire, so that's at a later period during and after the Babylonian exile. The Yahwist, basically the Yahwist policies did not work out. In spite of the Yahwist policies, Judah was not able to establish its independence, and it was not able to extend its territory. The opposite happened, and the Babylonians conquered the city or conquered Judah and occupied the city and destroyed the temple. So after that, we don't have kings anymore. We have governors and scribes and priests. And the Achaemenid Empire, as I pointed out earlier, was more tolerant in terms of religions than the nation states tended to be. The empires were more tolerant. And so they allowed the Judeans to return to Judah and reestablish the religion. And they did that for their own purposes. They wanted to have number one, they wanted to have some kind of a loyal outpost in that part of the world. And number two, they wanted that outpost to have some kind of stability. And they felt that supporting the Yahwists would do that. And they did. The empire, Cyrus and his successors did the same thing in other lands. It's not something that was unique for the Judeans. But this was an important area because it was close to Egypt. So the original element, the religious element, I'm reading the last paragraph, the religious element was the same for the official scribe Ezra, but the political intent was different. The Achaemenids were interested in Judean unity for the purpose of law and order, in other words, stability within their Yehud province. And the Achaemenids, who are the Persians, were also interested in this Judean unity for the purposes of imperial territorial defense. So the Persians were not interested in Judean independence or expansion. And so this was quite a change for the Yahwists, and they accommodated, they adapted their religious understanding. I don't think they changed their religious practices that much, but their religious understanding. Okay, the next slide. So basically, this is a point that the Yahweh's policies were not successful. I think that's an interesting point, because again, I don't think they had the same sense of politics and religion that we do, but this Yahweh's policy, which included elements that we consider political and we consider religious, just never really worked out. And so the goddesses were suppressed for certain purposes, and those purposes never really materialized. And that's kind of important. If you look at the note, many believe that the failure of the Yahweh's policies contributed to reinterpretations of God's covenant with the Jewish people. And that led directly to the book of Daniel, or at least contributed to the book of Daniel and Jesus Christ, where the Yahweh's policy was dedication to a single God, and we will achieve in our lifetimes political independence and even expansion. It was a political mission. And after the exile and the return, number one, the Jews realized that their Yahweh's policies had not really succeeded as regards immediate political or national independence or expansion. And number two, it was not going to materialize in the near future with the Persian Empire. So they reworked their understanding of the covenants that God had, the promises that God had made to them, because the Yahweh's God had promised them national independence and expansion. And the book of Daniel and Jesus Christ evolved more apolitical approaches, I would say apolitical understandings of heaven on earth. Heaven on earth was not, they tended to think, first of all, in more cosmic terms. It's not something that was going to happen immediately. It was going to something that would happen in Daniel at the end times. And in Jesus, I think, had a very apolitical vision when many people felt that it was going to happen soon. And some people thought, well, it had already happened, that we have already heaven on earth. And it doesn't really matter what the political arrangements are. So let's go on to the next. So Yahwism, the three periods of goddess suppression. So I'll give you a little more of the detail here. The King Hezekiah, he saw opportunities after the death of an Assyrian emperor. Then King Hosea, who saw opportunities for national independence and expansion during the decline of Assyria and the rise of Egypt. And then finally, the period of scribe Ezra, after the Judahite, that's one of the terms the scholars use, the Judahites elites returned from Babylon. Judah was no longer a kingdom. Ezra was dispatched to enforce Yahwism as the king's law, which is basically the emperor's law. And the dream of political of immediate national independence and expansion were set aside. Okay. The reign of King Hezekiah. So here we're going back. Hezekiah into this the Yahweh's period. Hezekiah reigned after the fall of the king of Israel to the Assyrians, till Tiglath-Pileser III. And after the Assyrians deported the tribes settled there at that time. And the tribes, these are all the 10 northern tribes of Israel, were deported probably by Shalmaneser, but some people think Shalmaneser and Sargon, and some people think just Sargon II did it, the deportations. But in this period, in the 720s, they were deported. And that's right when King Hezekiah had become king, and I think he was 24, 25 when he became king. So you can imagine these are really pretty dramatic developments for such a young king. And the kingdom of Israel refers to the kingdom north of the kingdom of Judah. Its capitals were Shechem and thereafter Samaria. Samaria was the capital with the Omride dynasty, which was the one that was deposed by the Assyrians. This area, now a province of Assyria, was resettled with peoples from around the Assyrian Empire. So they deported the 10 tribes and brought in different people. That was the settlement policy, the pacification policy of the Assyrians for territories that they conquered. These books go on to say it probably is not true that all of the Israelis were moved. Number one, it's probably, it'd be, governments, the efficiency of government operations were not that great back then. Maybe the wars they were very efficient warriors, but resettling a whole territory of people. But secondly, and this is probably the better point, is that it wasn't in the Assyrians' interest. Judea was a bit of a backwater. It was an isolated area that really was not integrated into the regional economy, the Assyrian economy. Whereas if you look at the map, the kingdom of Israel, which is north of, really almost immediately north of Jerusalem, is a lower land. It's more fertile. There's a lot more agricultural production that's more integrated into the regional economy. And it's really unlikely that the Assyrians would choose to move all of those people out when they're contributing so much to the Assyrian economy. What's more likely is that they tended to move out more of the city people and left the rural people, more of the rural people in place. And that's really consistent with later reports that are in the Bible that, some of the Israelites are still in the north. Okay. Now, the reign of Hezekiah. So after Sargon II died, in other words, all the resettlement had occurred, Hezekiah entered into an anti-Assyrian alliance backed by Egypt. And Hezekiah's regime engaged in tremendous public work. So here you see growth of the nation, of the city-state and the powers of government. They built walls. They built a huge aqueduct and cistern under Jerusalem. That wasn't the first such aqueduct and cistern. Those were being built as defensive measures in the big cities in those times. But Hezekiah built one that's really quite famous, and you can still visit it today. So that just shows that to engage in this kind of policy, you have to have a united nation state. You have to have tremendous concentration of resources for the public works. And to achieve this is what the scholars are saying. Hezekiah, the second paragraph, changed the religious practices and policies of his father Ahaz. He was the king of Judah just before him, and he moved away from a decentralized family and clan focused worship. That's what Ahaz had, towards a centralized priest-based, national-based worship, which excluded goddess worship. So again, I'm offering all of this information so that you can see that there's a context in which the goddess worship was suppressed. And it was part of a government policy to achieve national unity through a different kind of religion. That's why I've tried to be consistent here in talking about the traditional religion, if you will, as religious practices, because it's not the kind of religion that we tend to think of today. The kind of religion we tend to think of today is more the Yahwist religion, centralized, priest-based, and even creating some kind of identity, not necessarily national identity, but some sort of a group identity. All right, let's go on. And then 4 years after Sargon died, Sennacherib came to Judah with a formidable army, and he destroyed all of the cities in the foothills to the west of the Judean highlands. And that's the most fertile part of the country. And he really destroyed them because those guys were vicious. And and then he besieged Jerusalem, but failed to take it. And Jerusalem and his army withdrew, but with a payment of tribute from Hezekiah. And you can read the accounts. The biblical account's a little different. And the scholars take exception with the biblical account. The biblical account says that an angel of God came and killed 180 of Sennacherib's soldiers in one night, and for that reason he withdrew. But it also says in the Bible that Hezekiah paid a tribute. But the Finkelstein and Silberman in their book, they conclude that all in all, under the Yahwists, Judea suffered terribly. So basically, this policy did not work out for him. The next slide. So what was the Yahwism? In the temple, this is what Hezekiah did. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. Hezekiah also reestablished the orders of the priest and temple sacrifices and holidays. His father just had neglected all those things, and they fell into disabuse. And in its stead, there was the decentralized clan and family-based religious practices that included the goddess worship. And then, so in the temple, he reopened the temple, and then he removed the high places and smashed down the pillars and cut down the Asherah poles. Hezekiah trusted, it says in the Bible, Hezekiah trusted in Yahweh, the God of Israel, so that there was none like Hezekiah among the kings of Judah, either before or after him. The Bible also says the same thing about Josiah, because Josiah was also a Yahwist. But this shows it does make sense to pay attention to what happened in the temple and then what happened in the countryside. Later on, these are not as radical as some of the steps that Josiah took 2 generations later. Okay, let's go on. Again, Hezekiah, the Bible reports to us that the kingdom of Israel was destroyed when Hezekiah was a young king, so 29 to 30 years old. And in the 6th year, the king of Assyria carried the Israelites away to Assyria, because the kingdom, and this is an important thing, because the kingdom of Israel did not obey the voice of Yahweh. That's a key point, that the biblical history, and these are called the Deuteronomic, the histories in the Bible, they say that the Assyrians were basically destroyed and deported because they did not obey the voice of Yahweh. And what did they have instead? They had the traditional religious practices, which included the goddess worship. And so the Yahwists have not given up on Yahwism in spite of the setbacks that they suffered under Sennacherib. Okay. Hezekiah eliminated goddess worship as part of his effort to enforce Yahwism, an element of Judah's policy for national defense against Assyria and other enemies. The Bible reports to us, and the priests and prophets no doubt reported to Hezekiah, that the neighboring kingdom of Israel was recently destroyed early in Hezekiah's reign because the Israelis did not obey the voice of Yahweh. And here the Israelis are the 10 northern tribes. I think one reason that Judah survived is it's a more defensible position. Okay, and again, the Bible reports that the Assyrians exiled the Israelis from the kingdom of Israel because the people of Israel built for themselves high places at all of their towns. From every watchtower to fortified city, they set up for themselves pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. So here I've established the context for the suppression of the goddesses, but here under Yahwism, they really do zero in and focus on the goddesses as a principal cause for the fall of the northern kingdom. Okay. Here again, Hezekiah was confident that he would prevail against the Assyrians or any other enemy because he was faithful to Yahweh alone. I don't think we need to read that. You can read that on your own. And I would recommend looking back at these historical books of the Bible. They're really quite short and very easy to read. Okay, the next. And I've already covered this, so we don't need to talk about that. But here is no, we don't need to go back. Here, this is a quote from the Assyrian record about the Judean campaign. So again, this is what people call historical attestation, not biblical attestation. So you get just simply a different perspective, and you can see that yes, Sennacherib acknowledges that the Jew did not submit, but he did destroy all of the smaller towns, and that Hezekiah paid a very heavy ransom, including his own daughters, concubines, and male and female musicians. That's at the very end. Okay, you can look that up if you want and go on. Manasseh became the king after Hezekiah. He was the king between Hezekiah and Josiah. And after the death of Hezekiah, that's 3 years after the subjugation of Judah. And when I say subjugation, Hezekiah had to pay a heavy tribute every year after Sennacherib left Judah. King Manasseh, his son, abandoned the Yahwist party and reintroduced the traditional Judahite religious practices. And then during Manasseh's long reign, it's about 50 years, looks like, Judah was integrated into the Assyrian economic sphere and prospered. Again, there's a quote from the book on that. And that all in all, Judah flourished under Manasseh's policies, including the diverse, decentralized, family and clan-centered, inclusive religion. That's including the goddess worship. And I'm not sure it needs to be true, but it seems to be true that the isolationist and nationalist go-it-alone policies of Hezekiah, and we'll see later from Josiah, tended to include, really, it's an economic failure. And when they embraced the more open society, I guess that needed to include a more open religion, and that embracing the more open religion led to including the open society, led to a more prosperous economy. And so that's what was going on. But when Josiah became king, and let's go on for that. After Josiah and during the exile, this is a little bit about also this is a second slide about the goddess worship. I'll leave you to read this, but it just shows that the goddess, at the very first line, the deep-rooted Asherah cult was not restricted to the rural districts. There is ample biblical and archaeological information that the syncretistic cult of Yahweh flourished in Judah, in Jerusalem, even in the late monarchic times. In other words, the goddess culture was, as they say, very deep-rooted and persisted throughout this whole time. Okay. This, I don't think we'll spend time on this. This is the assessment from Finkelstein. It basically repeats what's already been said, so we can go on. And this is kind of just an interesting quote from Finkelstein. It probably shows a little bit there, if there's any, their inclinations. The second paragraph, some of the rural priesthood who did not write the Bible might have argued that it was in fact Hezekiah's blasphemous destruction of the venerated high places and his prohibition against worshiping Asherah, the stars, moon, and other deities, along with Yahweh, that brought such misfortune to the land. So they're making the point here that the Bible is giving one point of view on this historical period. Okay. And then we get into Josiah, which has more of an expansionist policy. So the second paragraph, as with Hezekiah's policies of national independence for the kingdom of Judah, remember he wanted to stop paying the tribute that his father had been paying to the Assyrians. But Josiah wanted something a little different. He wanted to expand the kingdom of Judah into what had been the northern kingdom, in effect, retake the northern kingdom from the Assyrians. And he thought he was going to do that with the help of the Egyptians. Unfortunately, when he met, people aren't exactly sure what happened, but instead of having an alliance, he met Necho II, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and the Pharaoh killed Josiah in a battle at Megiddo. And that was when Josiah marched his army out to meet Necho's army. So I think I think Josiah was already asserting some sovereignty over the northern territory, the old northern kingdom, because the Egyptians wanted to march through it to help the Assyrians in a battle against the Babylonians. But Josiah stood against him in the northern territory, even though Necho said, hey, we don't really have an argument with you people, please let us pass. And Josiah did not do that. This sort of extraterritorial assertion of sovereignty is similar to also what the assertions of religious policy into the north that he undertook. Okay, let's go on. I'm not going to read all this. You can read it, but it's just more confirmation from the scholars as to what I've said to you, that the Yahwist policy was an important part of this expansionist agenda. So let's go on. And we can go on. We don't need all that. Again, I wrote all this partly so that I would remember it, because this was really helpful for me. I did not know this. I don't really, I did not know this before. It was a surprise and kind of a shock, and it really helped me to have all this context, so I thought I would share it with you. we don't need to go over this. You can again look at this. Most of this I've already said, but here's what King Josiah actually did to promote the Yahwist policy. In the temple, the king commanded the high priest Kilkiah, the priests of the second order, and the guardians of the threshold to bring out of the temple of Yahweh all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the hosts of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron and carried their ashes to Bethel. Bethel is up north, so he's starting to carry these things up north. But here, this just shows that this is right before the Babylonian exile, and during his father's reign, there was installed in the temple religious articles for Baal, that's the male god of the northern Canaanites, Asherah, that's the consort of Yahweh, and for all the hosts of heaven. Those tended to be the Sumerian and Akkadian gods and goddesses. So King Josiah, brought out the image of Asherah from the house of the Lord outside of Jerusalem into the Wadi Kidron, burned it in the Wadi Kidron, beat it to dust, and threw the dust of it upon the graves of the common people. This is starting to get to me. This is zealous. Why is he throwing the dust onto the graves of the common people? There is a distinction here throughout these all of these historical chapters between the kings, the Aaronite or Aaronid priests. That's how the Aaronid is the correct term. The Aaronid priests, then the other Levites, who are the priestly class, and they were not the high priests. Only the descendants of Aaron were high priests. These priests were cantors, singers, or gatekeepers, and the rest. They fulfilled certain functions in the temple. So the fact that he would do something really kind of, I guess, degrading the graves of the common people is just disturbing for me. Okay, let's go on. And in Judea, this is what he did in Judea. So in the countryside, and this is all directly from the Bible because it's quoted really approvingly in the Bible. Josiah deposed the adulterous priests from the kings, whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings in the high places at the cities of Judah and around Jerusalem. Also those who made offerings to Baal, to the sun, the moon, the constellation, and all the hosts of heaven. So these are basically all of the priests. I think it also includes certainly these are the priests who worship gods in addition to Yahweh. And then King Josiah brought all the priests out of the towns of Judah and defiled the high places where the priests had made offerings to Yahweh. I'm not quite sure to whom. From the suggestion in the text, the scholarly text is, it was to Yahweh. From Gabor and Beersheba, he broke down the high places, because you're not supposed to worship Yahweh any place other than at the temple in Jerusalem. He broke down the high places of the gates that were at the entrance of the gates of Joshua and the governor of the city. That's Jerusalem, which were on the left at the gate of the city. I read a note somewhere that people aren't really sure where that is. And then the king Josiah defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem. This is also interesting. To the south of the Mount of Destruction, so it's a hill east of Jerusalem, where King Solomon had built for Astarte, the abomination of the Sidonians. So Astarte was the goddess of the Sidonians that was referenced earlier, but you can see that 300 years later, this construct, whatever it is, probably an altar to Astarte, is still there. Oh, here it is. It's a pillar. He broke the pillars in pieces, cut down the Asherah poles, and covered the sites with human bones. Again, that's kind of a desecration of the site, but also those human bones. Okay, let's go on. And so then what did he do at Israel? This is up north. This is the new kingdom where he wants to take control. Moreover, the altar of Bethel, the high place directed by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, that was the old king of the northern kingdom, who caused Israel to sin. Israel, here's the referral to the north kingdom. He pulled down the altar along with the high places, and he, Josiah, burned the high place, crushing it to death. He also burned the Asherah pole. So here, this is important because he's gone into the northern kingdom and is asserting some control there. As Josiah turned, and this is a continuation of the text, he saw the tombs that were on the mound, and he sent and took the bones out of the tombs and burned them on the altar and defiled it. So he's digging up the graves of these goddess worshipers and he's burning them on the altar. And moreover, Josiah removed all the shrines of the high places that were in the towns of Samaria. So this is throughout the northern kingdom, where the kings of Israel had made, which the kings of Israel, that's the northern kingdom, had made, provoking Yahweh to anger. He did to them what he had done to Bethel. So he repeated these desecrations in all of these places. And then this is the last action. King Josiah slaughtered on the altars all the priests of the high places who were there and burned human bones on them. Then he returned to Jerusalem. So he's slaughtering all the priests of the goddesses in the old northern kingdom. So, next slide. And then we get into Ezra. Ezra without, there is no kingdom now. I see we're almost getting to the end here. So let's just, I've already made the points that I think I need to make about Ezra. Let's just go a couple more slides here. The key point here, a couple points. This is the history. It didn't, moving out of Judah, moving back, it didn't happen all at once. But one of the things that did happen as they moved back is that the descendants of the house of David disappeared from Judean history. The first two leaders of the waves of returnees were from the house of David. They're mentioned as taking people in, and then they're not mentioned anymore. And then 80 years after the first return, the returning elites, these are the priests who had been taken away. These are the priests and the priestly class and basically the high classes of Jerusalem who'd been taken, and then they moved back starting in 539. But by 458, when Ezra returns, these people were again marrying foreign wives. And Ezra gets upset about that. So let's go on. And he calls upon this is a little more of the history in that Ezra now, remember, there's no more a kingdom. So he's a scribe, he's not a priest. He has, but he is given powers, judicial powers, to enforce the laws of the Yahwist laws, the Deuteronomic laws, as if they were the law of the land, the king's laws. He has the power to enforce punishment. And that's at the very end here. Death or banishment or confiscation of goods or imprisonment. And he used those powers. The next slide. This is a quote. We don't need to go over this. You can read this from the Britannica online. It's the best summary I found of Ezra. And he used these powers to get these priests and their families to abandon their wives and their children. So again, this is a bit of a coercive measure, I would say. Okay, the next slide. And that's also, I've got that. That's just more background. We don't need that. And then the same thing happened when Nehemiah came back. This was a few years later. They were still marrying foreign women. And Nehemiah took a stand against that. But he didn't say you can't keep your wives. He just said you shouldn't be marrying foreign women anymore. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Okay, next slide. We don't need to do that or cover that or that. Or that, we don't need to do that. Now, here's the thing up from Christianity. You might remember that we talk about the abominations that were practiced because of the foreign wives. And that's basically goddess worship. That abominations that led to such drastic measures, including killings by Josiah or executions by Josiah in the Christian era, were taken up by the Catholic Church and became heresy. And heresy was also punished by execution. And here's Thomas Aquinas, who wrote in the 1200s. He was a Dominican monk and also a professor, and is a very influential writer on theology and the law. And here he is endorsing the execution of heretics in the 1200s. This was the period when the Inquisitions, one of the periods when Inquisitions were being conducted by the Catholic Church in southern France and northern Italy, and I think a little bit in Spain around Barcelona. And the Thomas Aquinas is on board for that, and that the heretics, the very last line is that the heretics should be exterminated from the world by death. And in the first paragraph, he says that that's really the best for them, that they're better off dead than alive because they're heretics. So this exclusionary, really intolerant attitude at its height, expressed by Josiah, is carried into this Catholic Church, the Catholic tradition, and is used to enforce a monotheism that is defined by the Pope, by the Catholic Church. It's really very much like Yahwism under Josiah. Now, I don't really plan on doing Christianity because this was a lot of work doing Judaism. But if people are interested in that, they can let me know. It ties into the goddess worship because the very first inquisitions by the Catholic Church were against the, quote, witches who were in Northern Europe. The Catholic Church extended its reach into Northern Europe, just as with the Northern Kingdom and Judah itself. Not everybody was on board for monotheism. They had their traditional religious practices that included goddess worship. They had their priestesses, which the Catholic Church called witches. These witches were engaged in healing practices and divination, which is really exactly what the Sumerian priestesses were doing in 300 BC. This is already now 1200 BC. or AD, so 4,000 years later. And now the Christians are persecuting the witches. And I've read estimates that there are as many as 50,000 witches were executed. I'd have to check that figure. But one of the points here that ties us into goddess worship is that the procedures that were used to try the witches, developed by the Dominicans to try the witches, became the procedures that were used to persecute or prosecute heretics throughout the Middle Ages by the Catholic Church in Europe. So there's some continuity here that's to me is somewhat disturbing. With that, I will wrap things up, and I know I'm glad to stay for questions and discussions. Turn it back to Evanique.
Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us. If anyone has any questions or comments, you can either type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom.
Is anybody interested in Christianity?
Joe.
Go.
Yeah, I am actually interested in Christianity, but although Brian, this is an amazing presentation, and I'm thankful actually that Shrikant shared the file. I mean, because this is just an incredible amount of information, and it's just so well done. I can't thank you enough. That you kept me mesmerized the whole time. The one thing that kind of sticks out to me is just how damaging monotheism can be, or to the feminine, essentially, how it actually just drowns out any not only is it's also violent towards the people too. It just seems like it's a way of controlling the people, and every time that it gets instituted, it doesn't seem to turn out well at all. That's just a comment that I noticed. I'm following there's some other things that I'm just going through and looking at what I highlighted in my screen on my PowerPoints, but that's just an initial comment that I was thinking throughout. But yes, I would be interested in Christianity as well.
Okay, thank you for that.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? If you do, you can type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Going once, going twice. If anybody doesn't have anything else, I would like to say a special thank you to Brian. So he's been doing a lion's share of the work for these past two meetups and doing a lot of research. So next month, I'm going to be starting with the Virgin Mary. We're going to talk about the Virgin Mary. I'm going to do it based off the book by Isabella Price. We're going to go back to the book, and I'm also going to do some other research. So I hope you join us for that. And if there are no other questions or comments, Penny, are you? Penny, are you trying to? Oh, I'm sorry. 1 minute. Hold on. Try it now.
Okay. I just wanted to, I thought it was, the history was fantastic, and just wanted to point out kind of from a woman's perspective, though, as part of the policy of the Yahwist, they wanted to particularly get rid of the rights that women had in the goddess worshiping societies. They were economically independent, sexually freedom, and had legal rights. And they wanted to take away those rights as part of creating their state where Yahweh ruled. And so in doing that, they stripped the rights of women away and made them dependent on their husbands or their fathers, and really created them as a secondary class of citizens that was beholden to the males in their life and controlled by them. And they created a concept of sexual morality for women, which basically went against what the goddess worship, was, when there was more freedom for women. And but it only applied to women. So, women had to be virgins, and they had to only have relations with their husbands. But men could have multiple wives, and they could have concubines. And there was nothing immoral about that. But for women, women had to be totally controlled. And this same attitude continued in the Christian church, suppressing women and their rights.
Thank you, Penny. Up next, I have Joe.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Brian, you comment. Did Yahwehism's expansionist policies really cause the feminine to be kind of drowned out of or even to be no longer worshipped? Every time it seems like they expanded, that they would actually kind of move towards a monotheistic tone.
If I understand the question correctly, I would say no, the Yahwist policy was never completely successful, either on what we would call a religious sphere, in the religious sphere, or what we would call political. They didn't achieve the independence they wanted. Hezekiah wasn't able to do away with the tributes his dad was paying. He had his most fertile lands were all destroyed. Those lands, by the way, were given away to the Philistines. So Judea was smaller, and then he had to pay a tribute. So was not successful politically, and it was not successful, religiously, because the worship of the goddess still continued. But they tried to suppress it for the purpose of the national unity.
Right.
Concentration of this power, like the army and the public works and all the rest. They felt that the religious unity was part and parcel of that. And that tended to be the thinking of these smaller city-states and smaller nations, if you will. The city-states wanted to become a nation in that way. The empires realized that was not possible, but the nations tried to do that, but they really weren't that successful. And that's even true in the early Christianity. The word pagan. If you use the word pagan, it has a defined meaning, in current English. But if you look it up, it's pagani, and that means the people living in the countryside. And in Latin, I think probably late Latin and early Italian, and they use that word because even centuries after Christ, and I'd have to check, but I think even centuries after the church was, certainly a century or two after the church was created, the Christian religion was primarily an urban phenomenon. and the people in the countryside still worshiped the traditional gods in Italy and Greece and the Balkans and the rest.
Hmm.
So it's never been 100%.
And just something to add to Brian's point, if you notice in Christian religion, they take a lot from pagan traditions. Obviously winter solstice, Christmas, Advent falls around winter solstice, spring equinox relates to Easter and rebirth, and resurrection and new life, right? So there's a lot of influences that paganism had on Christianity, even though ironically Christianity tried to quash, religions that were primarily led by women, yet they took those traditions. Now, in the Virgin Mary, just a little preview, one of the things that Isabella Price says in her book is that, there's iterations of the Virgin Mary that we see throughout the culture. And that was, in a sense, the reason why you see so many iterations of the Virgin Mary is because when Christianity tried to expand and take over the world, usually by force, that's the way they hid their worship, is by putting it in the Virgin Mary. So you're going to see, in the next presentation, how the Virgin Mary in her various forms. I don't like to say the word forms, but I'll come up with a better term. But in her various ways, women in particular, were hiding their gods and goddesses within Mary because it was acceptable and they would not get in trouble for it. Right?
Yeah, that came out, for example, in the chapter and the presentation on ocean, the African goddess, the Nigerian goddess, who had kind of a diaspora with the slave trade into the Caribbean and Brazil, and was the basis. The worship of ocean was the basis, disguised as Mother Mary, was the basis for the Santeria religions that are still active. The one thing that I did try, I've looked a lot at this, and I just see it over now. It's getting to be decades that and you pointed this out, Evanique, the Christian religion and the Jewish religion derive a lot from what the Yahwist would denounce as foreign peoples, and they think that it's not valid if it comes from foreign people. And I think it just adds validity. If this is a tradition that has been nurtured and recognized and nurtured by many people over millennia, I think it has more, for me, it has more validity than something that's nurtured by a few people in the Judean highlands for, 200 years.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brian. I agree. It's funny that, the more you try to suppress something, the more it comes out in different ways, in different forms.
Yeah.
And I think you can see that all throughout history. When cultures are suppressed, there's still something that hangs on there. So if anybody else doesn't have any questions.
There's one quick one I have that I would like to ask, is that the Iron Age saw a decline in the goddesses, right? And do you have any theories as to why that is?
I think men became more ascendant.
Me too.
Yeah, that's the short answer.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, it becomes more of a warring kind of state and less focused on peace or things like that we talked about a little bit earlier. Anyway, that's just a thought.
Thank you, Joe. Anybody else? Go. Penny, looks like you're getting something. Are you about to say something?
Oh. No, I had just told Brian that Judy had asked about what were some of the names of the goddesses in that period today. I think Astarte and
Yeah, there's Astarte was the Sidonian. The different city-states had different names. Ashera tended to be the name in Judea. And but wow, if you just Google Astarte or Ashera, you'll see all the names. Plus, you'll run across other goddesses. The Canaanites, the northern Canaanites, had a triumvirate of 3 goddesses. One of them was a warrior goddess named Anant. Another one was Astarte. Again, these names varied from city to city. And the third one I don't recall. But Anant was a warrior goddess. Astarte was more, I think, some of these, it was more of a feminine, I guess, young woman goddess. And I think the last one was more of a motherly figure. I'd have to just check. I don't remember all that. But what strikes me from all of these is that Inanna, the initial goddess, one of the first goddesses in recorded history, she had all of these traits. And then over again, centuries and beyond centuries, over the millennia, these traits were divided up into different goddesses and slightly different goddesses in different places. Each city was its own city-state. And they tended to have very similar gods and goddesses. It was synchronistic, but they had different names. Slightly different names.
Thank you, Brian. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, for example, in the scholars think that there at least there've been 4 different eras in which these books of the Bible, the ones we've been talking about, were written. It was all of them happened during the existence of the northern and southern kingdoms. And one of them referred to God as El. And El is the name, that was the northern kingdom. And El is the name of the Canaanite god, which was also from northern Canaan, the Phoenician area, Sidonia, Tyre, and the rest. He was the father of Baal. And Yahweh was that one of the versions was supposedly written in the northern kingdom, and they used the word El. One was written more in the southern kingdom, they used the word Yahweh. And so these 2 versions are referred to as the E version and the J version. The J version because another way to spell Yahweh is with starting with a J, like Jave. There's so many different spellings of the Hebrew word. And then there's the Deuteronomists. Those are the ones who were the Yahwists. They also wrote during this period, more at the end, towards the end of it, at the people think more during the kingdom of Josiah. And but there are a lot of differences between these versions. If you want to see what they are, you can buy the book by Friedman, Richard Elliott Friedman. It really captures it nicely for the general public. And and basically there are these, in addition to the different names, the there are different emphases. For example, in the J version, which was from Judah, the priests play a bigger role because Jerusalem is the location of the temple, and so the priests were located there. In the in the E version, the Northern Kingdom, Moses plays a bigger role. And and then there's another version called P, which was written by the priests, also during the same, people think during the same period or possibly during the exile. But Friedman thinks it was written during the same period. And it emphasizes even more the role of the high priests and the ritual and the sacrifice and the temple. And if you unpack these different versions, you do see that he really does focus on the law, ritual, and the role of the priests. And then finally, there's the redactionist version, and people, that was put together by Ezra or somebody, who delivered it to Ezra, and Ezra brought it to Jerusalem, and that melded all these versions together. So I guess I mentioned that just to point out that there are different names for these gods in different places.
Thank you, Brian. Does anybody else have anything they want to add, or any final comments or questions? Give it a few more seconds.
I might say that this has been a kind of a detour from what Evanique and I first had in mind when we started this and what Penny signed up for, which is more focusing on the goddesses and the positive things that they have to offer. This is really in response to questions that were, again, persistently and urgently asked by participants. So I hope this has answered the questions, and maybe we can get back more into the goddesses.
I like how you linked it to the scribal age too.
By the way, I've looked at Marshall McLuhan's work, and he doesn't use the word scribal age. He uses the word literary age.
Oh, interesting. I got to read that. I got to read more about McLuhan.
And that kind of makes sense to me when I was stumbling across all these priests.
Right.
And then I saw Ezra as a scribe, and the scholars are making very clear distinctions between priests and scribes. The priests and those who wrote, the priests wrote these different versions of the Bible. And so they're the literary ones who wrote this. And if you want the details, it's in those books. And that people think that, that they had some of the priests were more literary. They had libraries of these stories and traditions, and they put them together in different ways. And then once they put them together and they'd been adopted as policy, then the scribes would start copying them. Scribes didn't write it, they just copied it. And then, given the Yahwist view, which is very orthodox, and looks what happens if if you don't toe the line, and they catch you, the scribes are not free thinkers. They
No.
really aren't.
I can't imagine that they would be.
No.
Well, this is pretty amazing.
Yes, thank you, Brian. Thank you for the hard work that you put in tonight and last month. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight and sticking around afterward to have questions. And, thank you for your attention. We really appreciate it. And if there are not any other questions, Everyone have a great night and a great weekend. And if there are any veterans on the call, happy Veterans Day.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank
Right.
you, Brian.
You're welcome.
Take
Have
care.
a good night, everyone.
All right.